In a small town where everyone knew each other's name, something heartbreaking happened that left everyone in shock. The town had always been a peaceful place, filled with laughter and friendly faces, but that changed when Mr. Thompson, a beloved teacher and community leader, suddenly passed away. His death was unexpected, and it felt like a dark cloud had settled over the entire town. People who had never really spoken to each other before now found themselves quietly mourning together. The air was heavy with sorrow, and each day seemed harder than the last. It wasn't just the loss of a person. It was the loss of the warmth and kindness he brought to everyone's lives. Emily, a young woman in her late 20s, felt the weight of this loss more deeply than she expected. She wasn't just another member of the community. She had known Mr. Thompson since she was a little girl. He had been like a second father to her, offering guidance and support whenever she needed it. Emily had grown up admiring him, watching him help others, and offer advice with the kindest of hearts. It was hard for her to imagine the town without him, and even harder for her to imagine going on without him in her own life. Her world seemed quieter after his passing. Emily had always been an optimistic person, someone who brought joy to others. She loved to play the piano and would often fill the house with music, whether she was playing for fun or practicing for her students. But lately, the piano felt heavy, like it was waiting for something, yet she couldn't find the strength to play. Each note seemed to echo her sadness, reminding her of the emptiness she felt inside. She couldn't even bring herself to touch the keys. The whole town seemed to share this feeling of emptiness. People went about their daily routines, but there was no laughter in the streets, no cheer in the markets. The schools were quieter than usual, and the local church, which was always filled with people, felt eerily empty. The sadness was contagious, spreading from one person to the next, until no one knew exactly how to lift the weight that hung over them all. Emily noticed that, as much as the town tried to move forward, the grief wasn't just about losing Mr. Thompson. It was about the loss of connection. Everyone was so focused on their own sadness that no one knew how to come together and heal. The town seemed stuck in its sorrow. Emily could feel it every time she walked outside, every time she spoke to someone who could barely muster a smile. It felt like the life had been drained out of the place, and everyone was too afraid to talk about their feelings or even share their memories of the man they had all loved so much. At night, Emily would sit by the window, looking out over the quiet streets, wondering what to do. She knew she couldn't fix the town's pain, but she also knew that something had to be done. She just didn't know what that something was. Her thoughts turned to the piano, which was still sitting in the corner of her living room, gathering dust. What if she could bring people together through music? What if the sound of the piano, the one thing that had always brought her comfort, could help heal the town's grief? But even the thought of playing seemed impossible. How could she play when she felt like her own heart was broken beyond repair? Yet, deep down, Emily had always believed in the power of music. She had seen how it could lift spirits, make people smile, and even bring people together. Could music be the answer for the town? Could she play something that would help everyone feel less alone? The idea was terrifying, but it was the only hope she had left. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but perhaps it was worth trying. The thought of starting something that could bring the town together, even if it was just a small step, gave her a spark of hope she hadn't felt in days. She decided that, no matter how small it seemed, she had to try. And so, even though she didn't feel ready, Emily began to make plans. She would bring music back into the town, no matter how much it scared her. She would find a way to make the piano play again, not just for herself, but for everyone who was mourning the loss of the man they had all loved. It was the only way she could think of to bring a little light back into the darkness that had settled over the town. This was the beginning of Emily's journey, the first step toward healing not just her own broken heart, but the hearts of an entire community that needed hope more than anything. The town had been grieving for weeks, and the weight of sorrow seemed to hang over every street, every home, and every face. It wasn't just the absence of Mr. Thompson that weighed on the people, it was the unspoken question of how to move forward. The town had lost its spark, and no one knew how to find it again. The usual rhythms of daily life had been replaced by a kind of numbness. People went about their routines but did so mechanically, as though they were living in a fog of sadness. Emily, though she still felt the deep ache in her chest, couldn't shake the sense that something had to change. But what could she do? It was during one of these long, quiet days that she found herself sitting in the back of the small community hall, listening as the townspeople gathered to discuss what they could do to honor Mr. Thompson. There were murmurs of a memorial, a speech or two, and even the idea of planting a tree in his memory. But each suggestion felt hollow. The meeting grew more and more somber, and the faces around the table were heavy with confusion and uncertainty. Emily noticed the silence that filled the room every time someone suggested an idea, as if none of them felt like the right answer. It wasn't that the people didn't care, it was that they were stuck. They didn't know how to grieve properly, how to begin healing. The loss had shaken the foundations of the community in a way no one could have predicted, and it felt as though they were all waiting for something, though no one knew what. When it was her turn to speak, Emily hesitated. She had been thinking about it for days, and now that the moment had come, she wasn't sure if it was the right time. But something inside her pushed her forward, the same quiet voice that had encouraged her to believe in the power of music. So with a deep breath, Emily spoke up. "I think we need to do something different," she said softly, but with a conviction that caught the attention of everyone in the room. "We've been talking about memorials, but I wonder if we're all trying to honor Mr. Thompson the wrong way. Maybe what we need is not more silence, but a way to come together, to let our grief out in a way that brings us closer, not farther apart." A few heads turned, and Emily felt the weight of their gazes on her. I think we should play music," she continued, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger. "Music has always been something that has connected people. It's how we share our joy and our pain. If we could come together and play a piece, maybe, just maybe, we could start to heal." The room fell quiet. No one spoke for a long moment, and Emily's heart began to race. She had seen the same disbelief in their eyes when she first thought of the idea. It was as though they couldn't fathom that something as simple as music could make a difference. A few awkward chuckles broke the silence, and Emily felt her face flush. The laughter wasn't cruel, but it was full of doubt. People were hesitant to believe that music could heal what they had all been through. It was too easy, too naive. But Emily stood her ground. She wasn't asking for a concert. She was asking for something more intimate, something more genuine. A few people raised their eyebrows, and others exchanged glances as though unsure whether to support her or dismiss her. "Music?" One of the older men, Mr. Carter, finally asked, shaking his head slightly. "Do you really think that's going to fix all this?" "I don't think it's about fixing it," Emily replied, trying to find the right words. "It's about sharing it. We're all grieving, but we're also afraid to share it. If we can't talk about our pain, maybe we can let it out through music." Still, there was doubt. People didn't want to risk looking foolish. They didn't want to embarrass themselves in front of each other, especially not when emotions were so raw. But Emily didn't give up. She knew that the idea was strange, maybe even a little ridiculous, but she believed in the power of music to bring people together. If they could just give it a chance, she was certain it would make a difference. As the meeting dragged on, Emily quietly made up her mind. She didn't need their approval to make it happen. If they wouldn't organize it, she would. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect, but it might be the spark the town needed. The next day, Emily took action. She posted a small notice in the town's bulletin board, inviting anyone who wanted to join her in a piano performance. She didn't promise anything spectacular, just an opportunity to play and perhaps to heal together. At first, she was met with skepticism, but she was persistent. Slowly, some of the townspeople started to respond. At first, it was only a few, and their reactions were a mix of reluctance and curiosity. But Emily didn't mind. Every time someone said yes, it was a small victory. The word spread slowly, and one by one, people started showing up. Some were nervous, some were unsure if they could even play anymore, but they came. Emily was starting to see something she hadn't expected, the possibility that this small, unusual idea might just be the beginning of something more powerful than she had imagined. The first rehearsal was nothing like Emily had imagined. When she posted the notice on the bulletin board, she had no idea what to expect. In her mind, she pictured a group of townspeople coming together, creating something beautiful, something that could heal the deep sadness in the air. But as the day of the first meeting approached, Emily began to feel a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. Would anyone show up? Would anyone even be willing to try? To her surprise, people did come. Slowly but surely, the small community hall filled with a mix of curious faces and hesitant smiles. Some of the townsfolk brought their children along, and others came alone, unsure of what to expect. The air was thick with uncertainty, but Emily held on to the belief that the music could break through the walls of grief that everyone was carrying. The first person to arrive was Mrs. Lewis, an elderly woman who had once been known for her beautiful singing voice. Her hair was a soft gray, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her cane. She had always been a quiet woman, rarely seen without a book in her hands or sitting on her porch. But Emily had heard whispers over the years that Mrs. Lewis had once been quite the singer in her youth. Emily had never heard her sing, but something told her that Mrs. Lewis had more to offer than she let on. "Hello, Emily," Mrs. Lewis said, her voice soft but warm. "I don't know if I still remember how to sing, but I thought I'd give it a try." Emily smiled, grateful for her willingness to join in. "It's not about being perfect, Mrs. Lewis. It's about coming together and finding something we've all lost." The next to arrive was young Ben Thompson, Mr. Thompson's nephew. He was in his early 20s, tall, with dark hair that always seemed to fall in his eyes. Ben had grown up in the town, and everyone knew him as the quiet one, the one who kept to himself. He had always been a talented musician, but ever since his uncle's passing, he had withdrawn from the community. Emily hadn't seen him much, but she was relieved when he walked through the door, holding his guitar case. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this, but I figured it couldn't hurt," Ben said, his voice low but steady. Emily nodded. "It's about taking the first step. Whatever you're ready to give is enough." By the time the rehearsal officially started, the room was filled with a few more people, all unsure of what they were getting themselves into. Some had never played an instrument before, while others were former musicians who hadn't picked up their instruments in years. The variety of skill levels was overwhelming at first, and Emily could see the hesitation in their eyes as they glanced at each other. It wasn't just the music that was intimidating, it was the vulnerability that came with it. Emily took her seat at the piano, and for a moment, everything was still. She could feel the weight of their uncertainty in the air, like an invisible barrier that separated them. But Emily refused to let that silence define the moment. She took a deep breath and played a few simple notes, the soft sound filling the room. It was familiar, comforting, and yet the notes felt like a beginning, a way to break the ice. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Let's just play. No pressure. We'll figure it out as we go." The first few attempts were awkward, to say the least. The group stumbled over the melody, some players unsure of the timing, others unsure of the notes. Mrs. Lewis couldn't find the right pitch, and Ben's guitar didn't quite mesh with the piano. There were moments of uncertainty when people exchanged frustrated glances, unsure whether they were even playing the same song. It felt like chaos, beautiful chaos, but chaos nonetheless. But something unexpected happened. Despite the confusion, despite the missed notes and the hesitant chords, There was a sense of unity that started to form. It was in the way the group supported each other with quiet encouragement, in the way that Ben nodded when someone made a mistake, or when Mrs. Lewis laughed softly and apologized for her off-key notes. They weren't playing a perfect song, but they were playing together, and that was enough. As the rehearsal continued, Emily noticed the change in the room. The tension began to lift, replaced by a quiet excitement. People started to loosen up, their bodies shifting with the rhythm of the music. Emily could see the transformation in their faces. Eyes that had been dull with grief were now focused on something else, the music and the people around them. The music wasn't just a way to pass the time. It was a way to connect, to remind them that they were not alone in their pain. The moments of hesitation became fewer and fewer as the rehearsal went on. They weren't perfect, not by any means, but they were starting to find a rhythm. It wasn't about being flawless, it was about being there for each other, about sharing the space and the sound. The laughter that had once been scarce began to flow more freely. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the healing that came with being together. By the end of the rehearsal, there was a feeling in the air that Emily had been hoping for. It wasn't a grand moment of triumph, but it was something just as powerful, a sense of camaraderie, of understanding. The grief was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but for the first time in weeks, the town felt a little lighter. They were on the path to something bigger, and they were going to walk it together. The second rehearsal arrived, and this time, the room felt different. The initial awkwardness had started to melt away, but there was still a nervous energy in the air. Emily could feel it, the mix of hope and uncertainty, as the townspeople began to trickle in once again. The first rehearsal had broken the ice, but now they were faced with the challenge of creating something meaningful out of their shared grief. The weight of that challenge hung over them, but it wasn't as heavy as before. When Emily stepped into the hall, she noticed the familiar faces from last time: Ben with his guitar, Mrs. Lewis sitting by the window, her cane placed carefully beside her. But today, there were more people. The group had grown, though still small, and Emily could tell they were more serious this time. They were no longer there simply because they felt sorry for Emily or out of obligation. They were there because deep down, they too believed that music might just be the key to helping them heal. Emily took a seat at the piano and cleared her throat. But before she could speak, Mrs. Lewis spoke up. "You know," she said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with emotion, "I haven't sung in years. I'm not sure I can still carry a tune. But after last time, after hearing all of you try, I think I want to try again. I don't want to be afraid anymore." Her words struck a chord with Emily. She knew that Mrs. Lewis wasn't just talking about singing. She was talking about something much deeper, the fear of being vulnerable, of opening up to others when it felt safer to stay closed off. The grief they were all carrying wasn't just a burden. It was a wall they had built around themselves to keep the world from seeing their pain. And now Emily saw Mrs. Lewis, once so reserved, willing to break through that wall. "It's not about being perfect, Mrs. Lewis," Emily said, smiling. "It's about giving yourself permission to feel, to express, even if it's messy. Let's just play together and see where it takes us." And so, the second rehearsal began. Emily started with a gentle, simple melody on the piano, nothing too complicated, just something to ease them into the music. She watched as everyone took their seats, picking up their instruments with more confidence than the first time. Ben strummed his guitar softly, his fingers moving with more familiarity, though there was still a hesitancy in his eyes. Ben had always been quiet, but there was something about the way he played that drew people in. Emily knew that his music was more than just notes, it was a part of him. A part of his grief that he wasn't sure how to express until now. They began to play together, the sound of the piano blending with the gentle strum of Ben's guitar, and the soft hum of Mrs. Lewis as she joined in. For a moment, Emily closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. The sound was imperfect, yes, but it was raw, emotional. It was the sound of their collective sorrow, being let out into the world for the first time. It wasn't long before the others joined in. Each person contributing what they could, some with their voices, some with their instruments, and others with their quiet presence. The music swelled in the room, and Emily could feel the tension lifting. It wasn't just about getting the notes right anymore. It was about the act of coming together, of sharing something deeper than grief, a shared vulnerability, a collective courage. There were moments of discomfort. People still stumbled over their parts, unsure of the rhythm or the melody. But instead of feeling embarrassed, they started to laugh together. It was the kind of laughter that comes from a place of relief, a release of tension that had been building for far too long. It wasn't forced or uncomfortable. It was genuine, born out of the realization that they didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to be present. As the hours passed, something extraordinary began to happen. The people who had come to the rehearsal unsure of their place, Ben, Mrs. Lewis, and even the others who had never played an instrument before, started to relax. Emily could see the change in them, the way their shoulders loosened, the way their smiles became less forced. They weren't just playing music. They were beginning to heal. Slowly, the community was finding a rhythm, not just in the music, but in their own emotional journeys. Ben's guitar playing was the first thing that really caught Emily's attention. His fingers moved more confidently now, no longer stumbling over the chords. It was clear that the music had begun to flow more naturally from him. As he played, Emily noticed something else. His eyes were no longer filled with that deep sadness that had consumed him for so long. There was still grief there, but now it seemed like something he could carry, something he could hold without letting it define him. By the end of the rehearsal, everyone was tired, but in the best way possible. There was an exhaustion that came from having opened up, from having shared something deeply personal and yet so incredibly freeing. They weren't done yet. There was still so much grief to process, but Emily could feel it in her heart. They were on the right path. The music had done what words could not. It had brought them together in a way that was impossible to ignore. They had started the rehearsal unsure of what would come out of it, but by the end, Emily could see it clearly. This group of people, this small town, was no longer isolated in its sorrow. They were beginning to come together, piece by piece, note by note, in a way that could only be described as healing. As the final notes echoed through the hall, Emily allowed herself a deep breath. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something beautiful. The third rehearsal felt like a turning point. The room, once filled with uncertainty and nervous energy, was now brimming with a quiet kind of anticipation. Emily could sense it the moment she walked through the door. This time they weren't just showing up to play. They were showing up to connect. It was as if the music had begun to stitch together the raw, jagged pieces of their grief. And now, they were ready to take another step forward. This time, the group had grown even larger. There were more familiar faces, and a few new ones, people who had been hesitant before, but had decided to join in, drawn by the small but growing community of people who had found solace in music. It was remarkable how much had changed in such a short time. In the beginning, Emily wasn't sure whether anyone would return after the awkward first rehearsal. But now the group felt like something real, a collective of people, bound not just by their loss, but by a shared desire to heal. Ben was already there, sitting with his guitar, his fingers resting lightly on the strings as though he had been playing all along. Mrs. Lewis was there too, but this time she didn't hesitate. She took her seat by the window and began humming a soft tune under her breath. Emily noticed that, though her voice was quiet, it had become stronger, more confident, and that shift wasn't just in the music, it was in her. As the others trickled in, Emily greeted them with a smile, but she could tell they were all feeling the same thing, the change. The music had started to do something magical. It wasn't just about playing notes anymore. It was about sharing something that words could never express. Each person had begun to open up in their own way, whether through their playing or through the simple act of showing up. Emily had always known music could bring people together, but she never imagined it could do so much more. It wasn't just an escape from the pain, it was a way to live alongside it. "All right, let's start with something simple today," Emily said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet excitement. "I think we're ready for something a little more challenging, but we'll take it slow. No pressure. Just play what feels right." The group nodded, each person looking at the others with newfound trust. Emily sat at the piano, her fingers lightly brushing the keys as she started to play a slow, familiar tune. It was something that most people in the town knew, a song that had been played during the church services, a piece that had once been full of joy, but now carried a layer of sorrow. As the first notes filled the room, there was an almost immediate shift. The music didn't feel like an exercise anymore, it felt like a conversation. Each note was a word, each chord a sentence. Everyone had something to say, and the piano was the language they were learning to speak. At first, the music was hesitant. Some players stumbled over the melody, unsure of the timing, others unsure of the notes. But this time, it was different. Instead of frustration, there was understanding. They didn't need to be perfect. What mattered was that they were doing it together. The rhythm of the music started to sync with the rhythm of their hearts. The grief, though still present, was no longer isolating them, it was uniting them. Mrs. Lewis, who had once been so self-conscious about her voice, was now singing softly, her voice steady and beautiful. Emily could see the pride in her eyes as she allowed herself to be part of something bigger than just herself. There was something incredibly powerful about seeing her sing again, after all these years of silence. It was as though, with each note she sang, she was reclaiming a part of herself that she had kept hidden away. Ben, who had been so withdrawn at the start, was now playing with a passion Emily had never seen before. His guitar echoed through the room, each strum more confident than the last. His playing was no longer just a way to fill the space. It was an expression of his soul. Emily could tell that he was using the music to say everything he couldn't put into words. The grief that had once made him retreat into himself was now being expressed through his music. As the rehearsal continued, Emily noticed something else that surprised her, the way the group was starting to bond. The quiet conversations that began happening between songs were no longer just polite exchanges, they were real. People were sharing their stories, not just about Mr. Thompson, but about their own lives, their own struggles. They talked about their families, their fears, their memories of loved ones lost. The music had created a space where they could be vulnerable. And for the first time, it felt safe to open up, one by one. People began to share. Mrs. Lewis talked about her late husband, how they used to sing together in their youth. Ben shared a memory of his uncle, how Mr. Thompson used to take him fishing and teach him about life in a way that had always felt simple and true. The others followed suit, each adding their own stories to the growing tapestry of shared experiences. Emily listened, feeling a warmth in her chest. This was why she had started this, because she knew that the only way to truly heal was together. By the end of the rehearsal, the music was no longer tentative. It had taken on a life of its own, moving with purpose and strength. The room was filled with energy, but it wasn't the chaotic, nervous energy that had characterized their first meeting. No, this was something different. It was the energy of a community coming together, of people learning to live with their grief, and most importantly, of people finding a way to express that grief through the language of music. As the final notes echoed through the room, Emily couldn't help but smile. They weren't there yet, healing wasn't a straight line, but they were on the right path. And that was enough. For the first time, Emily truly believed that they could do this. They could play for the grieving, together. And in doing so, they could heal. The night of their fourth rehearsal arrived. And Emily walked into the community hall with a strange sense of anticipation. For the first time, there was a quiet optimism in the air, something she hadn't expected when she first started this journey. The sound of the piano no longer felt like a solitary instrument, but a voice that echoed the collective heartbeat of the group. What had started as a timid idea, fueled by a desire to help, had now become a lifeline for a community that was slowly finding its way out of the shadows of grief. People were starting to show up with an energy that was impossible to ignore. It was no longer a matter of just showing up, now. There was a palpable sense of purpose in the way everyone entered the hall. Some came early, like Ben, who had spent the day working on a new guitar arrangement. Eager to share it with the group, Mrs. Lewis, her face glowing with an inner light, came in humming the melody she'd been practicing at home. It was as if, with every rehearsal, they were not only learning to play music, but learning to live with each other's pain in a way that was meaningful and healing. As Emily sat up at the piano, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in just a few weeks. She could still remember the awkwardness of their first meeting, the tension in the air, the hesitant smiles, the uncertainty of whether the music would be enough to bridge the distance between their grief and their desire to heal. Back then, the music had felt like an experiment, a fragile hope that seemed almost too delicate to hold. But now it felt solid, real, raw, and deeply personal. It was no longer just a way to pass the time or a method of distracting themselves from their sorrow. It had become a language, one that allowed them to speak with each other in ways they never could have before. This evening was different, though. Emily could feel it in the air. There was a certain quietness that seemed to have settled over the group, as though everyone was waiting for something. They were ready for the breakthrough. They had been working so hard, pushing through their discomfort and self-doubt, and tonight, Emily was certain they would reach a new level. It was time for the group to finally confront the true depth of their grief, to let it spill out through the music. As the rehearsal began, Emily played the opening chords to a familiar song, something simple and soothing. At first, the group played it as they had done before, tentatively, almost shyly, but then, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Lewis, who had been holding back her voice for so long, let go. She sang out, her voice trembling at first, but then growing stronger with every note. Emily's fingers moved more confidently across the piano keys, and Ben's guitar joined in, adding a depth to the music that had been missing before. The sound filled the room, and Emily realized that this was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. The music wasn't perfect. It was far from flawless. There were a few missed notes, and the timing was off in places. But there was something so pure in the sound, something that transcended technical perfection. It was real. It was their grief, their pain, their hope, all woven together in one imperfect, beautiful melody. And then, unexpectedly, something even more profound happened. As the music swelled, the group began to share more than just notes and rhythms. They shared stories. Each note they played seemed to open up a new door, a new memory. Mrs. Lewis sang about her late husband, how they had once danced together in the kitchen to the very same song. Ben, his fingers moving fluidly over the guitar strings, talked about the days when his uncle would take him fishing, teaching him how to play the guitar by the campfire. It was a raw, vulnerable exchange, a letting go of grief in the most authentic way. The room was quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed what had just happened. There had been no judgment, no awkward silences. They had shared their pain without fear of rejection. And in doing so, they had allowed the music to fill the space where words had once failed. Emily watched, a lump forming in her throat, as the group began to realize something they hadn't before. They weren't just playing to honor Mr. Thompson anymore. They were playing for themselves, for their own healing. The rehearsal didn't end with a grand flourish or a final perfect chord. Instead, it ended in a soft, peaceful silence, one that felt heavy with meaning. The sound of their instruments faded away, but the weight of the shared experience lingered in the room. No one spoke immediately. There was no need for words. They had all said everything they needed to through the music. Emily stood up from the piano and looked around at the group, each person lost in their thoughts. She saw the way their faces had softened, the way they seemed more at peace. Ben, who had been so quiet in the past, now stood tall, his eyes shining with something Emily had never seen in him before, a quiet strength. Mrs. Lewis was smiling, her face radiant in a way that came from deep within. They had done it. They had taken a leap together, and they had caught each other when they fell. As the night drew to a close, Emily realized that this was the most significant moment of all. They had crossed a threshold. They weren't just people who had gathered to play music. They were a community that had learned how to grieve together, to heal together, and most importantly, to live with their pain while still finding joy in each other's company. As the last few people left, Emily lingered behind, her fingers lightly touching the keys of the piano. The room was still, but the music inside her kept playing. She had no idea where the next rehearsal would take them, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. They were ready for whatever came next. Because, in the end, they had found something more powerful than perfection. They had found connection. And that was all they needed. The night of the recital was finally upon them, and it felt like everything had led to this moment. The town's small community hall, usually a quiet, forgotten space, had been transformed. Fairy lights hung from the rafters, and a makeshift stage had been set up in the center of the room. It wasn't a grand venue, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was the feeling that hung in the air, a mix of nervous excitement, anticipation, and something deeper, a quiet sense of unity that hadn't been there before. Emily arrived early, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She was excited, yes, but also deeply aware of the gravity of the evening. This wasn't just about music anymore. This was about the entire town coming together to show that even in the face of sorrow, there was room for something beautiful. She had seen it happen over the past few weeks, the way the group had transformed, the way each person had begun to open up, to share their grief, and to heal in their own way. Tonight wasn't about being perfect. It was about being together. As the other members of the group trickled in, Emily noticed the subtle changes in each of them. Ben, once a quiet, withdrawn young man, now walked with his guitar slung over his shoulder, his head held high. Mrs. Lewis, who had hesitated to sing in public for years, stood confidently by the stage, her voice already humming the melody of the piece they had been working on. There was a calmness in her eyes now, something that told Emily that this night, this performance, was as much for her as it was for everyone else. The room began to fill with townspeople, the very same people who had sat in their homes, quietly mourning the loss of Mr. Thompson for weeks. The same people who had watched their community fall silent, unsure of how to grieve, unsure of how to heal. Now they were all here, gathered together to witness something extraordinary. The air was thick with emotion, but it wasn't just sadness anymore. There was a palpable sense of hope, of healing, in the way the crowd settled into their seats. Emily could feel the nervous energy of the group as they prepared backstage. Some were checking their instruments, others whispering to each other in hushed tones, but all of them shared the same unspoken understanding. This was it. This was their moment. The performance wasn't just about honoring Mr. Thompson anymore. It was about celebrating what they had become as a community. It was about showing the world that, even in the darkest of times, they could still come together and create something beautiful. As the lights dimmed, and the first few notes of the piano rang out, the audience fell silent. Emily played the opening chords of the song they had been rehearsing, the familiar melody filling the room with warmth. Ben's guitar followed, his fingers now sure and confident as he strummed the strings. It wasn't flawless. There were a few missed notes, a couple of timing slips, but none of it mattered. What mattered was the emotion behind each note. The way the music seemed to breathe with the life of the town itself, Mrs. Lewis, her voice a little shaky at first, joined in, her notes growing stronger with every passing second. The sound was no longer a simple tune, it was a conversation. Each note felt like an offering, each chord a way to say, "We are here, together, in this moment." The audience was captivated. Emily could see the faces in the crowd, the way people leaned in, drawn into the music. There were no tears of sorrow in their eyes now, but something else, something closer to peace. For the first time in weeks, the town's grief was no longer an isolating force. It was something they shared. The music became a bridge between their individual sorrows, uniting them in a way nothing else could. As the song came to its final note, the crowd sat in stunned silence, as if unsure whether the performance had truly ended or if the magic of the moment had simply stopped time itself. And then, it happened. A slow, steady ripple of applause began at the back of the room, hesitant at first, but growing with every passing second. Emily's heart swelled as the sound of clapping filled the hall, not just for the music, but for the people who had created it. She looked over at her fellow musicians, their faces lit up with something deeper than pride. It was the satisfaction of knowing that they had given everything, and that, in return, they had received something far more precious than applause connection. After the performance, the crowd lingered, chatting in hushed voices, wiping away tears, and exchanging looks of quiet understanding. The grief hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. The town, which had felt so distant from each other for so long, had found a way to come together. They had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on. It was about sharing, about creating space for pain and joy to coexist. Emily stood at the back of the hall, watching as people gathered in small groups, talking, laughing softly, and simply being present with each other. Ben had joined a circle of old friends, laughing for the first time in what felt like ages. Mrs. Lewis was surrounded by others, her smile wide as she spoke about the performance, her voice now strong and clear. It wasn't just a performance that had changed everything, it was what the performance had symbolized. It had symbolized a community learning to live with its grief, to move through it, to find hope in the midst of it. The music, the connections, the stories shared, it was all part of the same healing process. They hadn't just performed a song, they had performed an act of courage, of vulnerability, and of love. As the night drew to a close, Emily lingered by the piano, her fingers brushing the keys one last time. The music had ended, but the healing had only just begun. The town had found its rhythm again, and with it, a new sense of belonging. The grief would still be there tomorrow, but tonight, it had been transformed. And that was enough. The weeks following the recital felt like a dream that lingered in the air, faint but full of significance. Emily had often wondered whether the night of the performance would be a one-time experience, a beautiful moment of connection and healing, but nothing more. But as the days passed, she realized that something had changed within her town, something deep and lasting. The music had become more than just a temporary escape from grief. It had become a bridge to something new, something hopeful. The town had begun to fill with a new energy, a quiet but undeniable sense of unity. People who had once barely exchanged a glance now stopped to chat in the streets. Conversations, once laden with silence and awkwardness, now flowed freely. The music had opened doors that had long been closed, creating spaces for vulnerability and understanding that hadn't existed before. For Emily, the change was both subtle and profound. She found herself sitting at the piano more often than she had in the past, the familiar sound of the keys offering her a sense of calm she hadn't realized she needed. She played for herself, but also for the town. Her music felt like a tribute to what they had all been through together. Every time she pressed down a key, she could feel the presence of her friends, the people who had walked this difficult journey with her, and whose lives had become woven into her own, one afternoon. Emily decided to take a walk through the town. She had noticed a difference in the air, and she wanted to experience it firsthand. As she strolled down the main street, she saw familiar faces, people she had known for years, but who now seemed to carry themselves differently. Mrs. Lewis was sitting on her porch, her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with the sound of birds chirping. She waved at Emily, a smile lighting up her face that was as warm as the afternoon sun. Emily stopped to chat for a few minutes, and as they spoke, she realized just how much Mrs. Lewis had changed. The woman who had once been a stranger to vulnerability was now one of the most open and engaged members of the community. It wasn't just Mrs. Lewis. Everywhere Emily looked, there were signs of healing. At the local cafe, Ben was sitting with a group of friends, laughing as he strummed his guitar. His music had become a constant presence in the town, a soundtrack to the new life they were all beginning to build. He no longer hid behind his instrument, but played it with an openness that made him feel less like a loner and more like a central part of the town's heartbeat. Even the younger children, who had been too young to understand the depth of the town's sorrow, seemed to sense the change. They ran through the streets with laughter, their energy infectious. It wasn't that the town had forgotten the grief they had all shared. It was that they had learned how to carry it together, and in doing so, had found room for joy once again. Emily paused by the small memorial for Mr. Thompson that had been placed near the town square. It was simple, a plaque engraved with his name, surrounded by a few flowers. She smiled softly, her hand resting on the cool stone. She still missed him terribly, but there was a peace now that hadn't been there before. She knew that, in his way, Mr. Thompson had been a part of the healing process too. He had always believed in the power of music to bring people together, and now his legacy lived on in the songs they had played together, in the stories they had shared. Later that evening, Emily returned to the community hall where the piano still stood, waiting. She sat down and let her fingers run lightly over the keys, a gentle melody filling the air. It was a song that had come to her during one of the quiet moments in the days after the recital, a song she hadn't yet played for anyone. It was a song of gratitude, a tribute to the town, to her friends, and to the healing they had all gone through. As she played, she thought about what had been accomplished in such a short time. They had gone from a community divided by grief to one that was stronger, more connected, and more alive. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had learned that healing didn't happen overnight, and that it wasn't linear. There would still be hard days ahead, but there was something different now, a shared understanding that they didn't have to face it alone. As the last note echoed through the hall, Emily allowed herself a moment of stillness. The music had been a catalyst, but it was the people who had made the real difference. The way they had come together, the way they had learned to listen to each other, to share their stories, their pain, and their joy. That was the heart of the healing. The door to the hall opened, and Ben stepped inside, his guitar slung over his shoulder. He smiled when he saw Emily at the piano. "You playing again?" he asked, his voice light but with a trace of admiration. "Just thinking," Emily said, smiling back, "about how much has changed, about how far we've come." Ben nodded, sitting down beside her. "Yeah, it feels different, doesn't it?" "It does," Emily replied, her fingers brushing the piano keys once more. "But it's a good kind of different." They sat together in silence for a few moments, just letting the stillness settle over them. Then, Ben began to play, joining in with the piano in a soft flowing rhythm. Emily smiled as the music filled the room again, this time with the sound of something deeper, something more powerful. It was the sound of a community not just surviving, but thriving, and of a town that had found its way back to the heart of what truly mattered. And with that, Emily realized something else, that this was just the beginning. The music would continue, the healing would continue, and so would the connections that had been made. The grief would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed into something that could be lived with, something that could be shared. And together, They would keep playing as long as it took.